How many children do? They should have Queen Quet one more again for this show, Gullah Geechee Nation News. I'm so glad they have turning in again. One minute there to UN. This is time for the forum for the indigenous people and things like that. But look at children. We didn't talk about water and a human right and things like that. Now, how are going to be from the Siama and I know about our rights that the water, the court give all of it. So, 100 children, tune in for this show special episode. While we crack the teeth, but I leave it at this show thing, but we still the fight for in this show. Now, 100 know this show and what going on.
Members of the forum, at this meeting we shall begin our discussion on item 4A of the agenda, human rights, implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I first give the floor to Ms. Gali Sambo Duro to make a brief introductory statement. You have the floor now.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In these remarks, I want to emphasize the importance of the human rights-based approach as strongly recommended by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and diverse UN bodies and mechanisms. This must include the full and effective implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Some governments still do not recognize that Indigenous peoples' collective rights are human rights, yet the Human Rights Council has adopted by consensus Resolution 5/1 on June 18, 2007, which makes clear that the rights of peoples shall be permanently considered in its agenda and framework for the program of work under Item 3, Promotion and Protection of All Human Rights. Regardless of what issues may arise in any given situation, the human rights of Indigenous peoples are always relevant if such rights are at risk of being undermined. In this regard, it is difficult to remove from or segregate Indigenous human rights from any discussion. As I referenced yesterday, one of the fundamental elements of human rights is that they are indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated, and are therefore relevant in any context specifically concerning Indigenous peoples, from environment to development to peace and security and many other issues. At the international level and in many countries at the national level, there has been advancement on the recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples. At the domestic level, some governments have adopted legislation incorporating in its national bodies the recognition of Indigenous rights. However, the implementation of the standards contained in the Declaration remains our biggest challenge. As you all know, specialized institutions have been created at the international level to specifically address Indigenous human rights, such as the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, our forum, the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as the Voluntary Fund. The work of the United Nations in preparing the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples reinforced the need for instruments and processes to accommodate our cultural diversity. Indeed, this was the ultimate objective of the UN Declaration. Such an approach is a necessary element to ensure the effectiveness of universally recognized human rights. Despite all the positive international human rights standard-setting developments concerning our rights, Indigenous peoples continue to face serious human rights abuses on a day-to-day basis. Issues of violence and brutality, continuing assimilation policies, marginalization, dispossession of land, forced removal or relocation, denial of land rights, impacts of large-scale development, abuses by military forces and armed conflict, and a host of other abuses are a reality for Indigenous communities around the world. Examples of violence and brutality have been heard from every corner of the Indigenous world, most often perpetrated against Indigenous peoples who are defending their rights and their lands, territories, and communities. In regard to large-scale or major development projects, the Special Rapporteur has summarized some of their effects on the human rights of Indigenous peoples by stating that the principal human rights effects of these projects for Indigenous peoples relate to loss of traditional territories and land, eviction, migration and eventual resettlement, depletion of resources necessary for physical and cultural survival, destruction and pollution of the traditional environment, social and community disorganization, long-term negative health and nutritional impacts, as well as, in some cases, harassment and violence. Indigenous peoples frequently raise concerns about systemic discrimination and outright racism from the broader society, the state, and its authorities. This discrimination manifests itself in a number of ways, and I think that it's safe to say that each and every Indigenous person here in this room has experienced some form of discrimination on the individual personal level. Furthermore, Indigenous peoples at the community level, or collectively, have been victims of discriminatory policies and treatment. This is an undeniable fact. At their most extreme, these forms of discrimination lead to gross violations of human rights, such as murder, rape, and other forms of violence or intimidation. These forms of discrimination are often either difficult to quantify and verify, or are simply not documented by the authorities, or not disaggregated based on Indigenous identity. Among all the members of the society, the situation of Indigenous women and children remains particularly delicate. Many Indigenous communities are in extremely difficult situations. Many Indigenous peoples and their communities have been destroyed or weakened, their security and integrity compromised. Furthermore, where national human rights institutions exist, such institutions should be informed and guided by the Declaration. Where they do not exist, such institutions should be established with the full cooperation and collaboration with the Indigenous peoples concerned. Indigenous peoples should also be encouraged to engage domestic remedies, such as local commissions. Further, Indigenous peoples should review and invoke international instruments and initiate comprehensive strategies, including the use of the treaty bodies. As most, if not all, of these treaty bodies are aware of and responsive to the human rights standards embraced by the UN Declaration. In this regard, please recall the expansion of the mandate of the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples based in Geneva. In some instances, Indigenous peoples may have opportunities to negotiate and dialogue with national governments about how to fully and effectively implement the Declaration. In other instances, unfortunately, Indigenous peoples may need to initiate litigation combined with formal human rights complaints at the local, statewide, regional, national, or international level. In conclusion, I urge governments to consider what measures they can take in collaboration with Indigenous peoples to ensure that Indigenous peoples, communities, and nations, again, individually and collectively, can in fact exercise and enjoy their basic human rights and fundamental freedoms. After all, as the preamble of the UN Declaration solemnly proclaims, the UN Declaration is a standard of achievement to be pursued in a spirit of partnership and mutual respect. Let us hope that we do not have to wait generations more for the realization of partnership and respect. In regard to the discussion this afternoon, I'm sure that myself and all of the Permanent Forum members look forward to hearing about the actual status and conditions facing Indigenous peoples worldwide in relation to the mandate of the Permanent Forum, and I would urge you to make specific reference to articles in the Declaration when intervening and sharing with us your concerns and perspectives and the status and conditions of your people. Thank you very much.
Thank Ms. Dali Sambo for her statement.